this was going to be, so I changed my title. This was going to be an effort to do something a little more general. I was calling it something like Why Should We Dare to Know? Or the meta-ethics of Verwahrhalten. So I was thinking about I am working on coming up with a sort of view about not what the norms of assent are, so I've kind of published some stuff on that already, but on why Kant thinks we ought to follow the norms of assent, what the kind of fundamental good involved here is, why Kant thinks that the right thing to do is to be a qualified evidentialist, or at least on my view, he's an evidentialist about a certain kind of Verwahrhalten, namely the ones that he calls convictions, Überzeugungen, and he's a pragmatist about other kinds of assent or Verwahrhalten, especially the ones that he calls belief or Glaube or faith. So I have a kind of reading about what's supposed to motivate that. But I decided, basically I'm in the middle of a kind of a hope tour at the moment. So last week, actually, Robert Stern was there at this conference in Manchester on faith and hope, and then next week I'm going to the Peking first Chinese conference, which is on the future of humanity, and so they wanted me to talk about hope, and so I thought my head is more in the hope mode at the moment, and so that I would talk about assent, about Verwahrhalten, but a little bit more about hope and moral arguments which relate to the pragmatism side of Kant's what I was calling qualified evidentialism. So this comes out of a effort to actually initially think about what's sometimes called in the ethics literature the causal inefficacy objection to certain kinds of, especially consequentialisms. So the idea is, in our contemporary context, we're caught in these kind of massive systems whose reach is opaque and unfathomably great, to the point where we feel as though we very likely cannot make a difference. Certainly with our one-off purchasing behaviors, we very likely won't make a difference. And on certain act consequentialist pictures, that suggests that it shouldn't matter whether or not we go ahead and consume the product that we actually think is morally wrong to have been made in the way that it is, or produced in the way that it is, or distributed in the way it is. So there's this movement of opportunists in that literature who suggest that the thing to do is to focus, sort of effective altruism-y thoughts, focus on the stuff that really matters, try to change the laws, petition, write to your representative, but the occasional purchasing is no problem. And so I thought that that's a sort of bizarre thought, though it's also intriguing in a way, and I started thinking about it and thinking about what would be required in order to make sense of the idea that we can believe in some sense that our actions, our individual actions, will make a difference, and whether that can be based in pragmatic grounds. So then I started thinking about it in the context of Kant's moral arguments, and so that's where this part of a larger project comes in that I want to share with you today. So I think that Kant actually has at least three different formulations of the moral argument. In the first critique, there's this scandalously un-Kantian way of articulating the moral proof. Some people, Henry Allison and Alan Wood, try to gloss over this, but my sense is that he hasn't really worked this out yet in the canon of pure reason, where he's talking about the moral proof for the first time. And he says things like, morality is admirable, but it doesn't actually incentivize us. It doesn't motivate us. Our appreciation of the moral law isn't sufficient to get us to sort of go for in a kind of internalist way, go for what we take to be the thing we ought to do. So then the divinely secured happiness in the afterlife is supposed to be part of the motivation for being moral. And, quote, therefore the system of morality is inseparably combined with the system of happiness. So you get the highest good and God and so forth, in part because otherwise, he says, the ideas of morality are admirable and impressive, but not motivating. Okay. That's not such an attractive form of the argument. In the second critique, he gives the canonical version. We ought to will the highest good. This is the state in which yours and my virtue is precisely proportioned to our happiness. Perfectly just society, even if not a perfect society. If you're rational, when you will the highest good, you also will, or you, in some sense, take it to be really possible. And it turns out that the existence of God and the future life and so forth are part of what it is for that to be really possible. That's the canonical version, and it's been much discussed, and it's interesting. I think the first premise is actually a little hard to motivate. Why ought we will the highest good? Why, for Kant, do we need to will the highest good and not just will to do the moral law? There are some other questions that people bring up, but I don't want to talk about that here. What I want to do is talk about what I take to be a third kind of reconstruction of the moral proof, or a way of arguing that is sort of broadly moral in Kant's sense, that I think you can find in the third critique, the theory and practice essay, and in the religion. Here, the first premise is narrower, so it is just you ought to will the moral law, you ought to will to be virtuous. The moral law is the only source of motivation, so that's kind of takes care of the problems I was citing with respect to the first two formulations. And then this thought is you're morally justified in adopting various attitudes, pro-attitudes, maybe even propositional attitudes towards, in this case, God and the afterlife, as a way of avoiding despair or sustaining hope, avoiding despair. So the big picture questions here that I want to look at, first in the context of Kant, and then a little bit later, if we have time, in a more contemporary mode, questions are things like, suppose we do have moral justification, as you might think we do, to adopt strategies that allow us to avoid moral despair, avoid this giving up, this sense of futility in the face of these massive systems which we almost certainly can't change through our individual behaviors. Suppose we can take on such strategies. What if those strategies involve us also believing certain things, or forming belief with a capital B in certain things? So that's how I've tended to signify Kant's conception of Glaube. I don't think there's any good English translation for that term, but belief with a capital B kind of looks German, and so I do it that way. And can the objects of these attitudes be sort of measurable things in the empirical world, like things you could actually go and check out? Or do they have to be super sensible items whose truth is undecidable? Finally, does it matter if these things are even true? So you're talking about Fürwahrheit and holding for true, but is it their truth that really matters, or is it that you hold them for true that matters? And how do we distinguish between those two senses of mattering? And moreover, avoid wish fulfillment and self-deception. So those are some of the big picture questions. I want to talk about this third version of the argument and lay it out pretty exhaustively, just so you have it before you. So remember, Kant's third great question is, what may I hope? Where the first two are, just keep everybody awake after lunch. What's the first great question in philosophy?
What can we know?
What can we know? And second, what ought I do? Anyone know the fourth? Good. What is man? Any suggestions about the fifth? What is enlightenment, maybe? I think of it. In the logic lectures, he actually mentions what is the human being. Good. So what may I hope? Hope, he says in the canon, is always directed at happiness. It concerns happiness. But of course, to be rational, the hope has to also be constrained by moral considerations. And in particular, he seems to think considerations about justice. So the highest good, as I mentioned earlier, is the state in which everyone has happiness in the same measure as he or she has made themselves worthy of it in their acts. So perfect justice, again, is just perfectly proportioned happiness to virtue. Kant also seems to think that, this is in the religion now, that there's a sense in which we can hope not just for happiness, but hope for things that are kind of consequent upon our doing our duty, which is something I want to elaborate a little bit. But here, this passage, for instance, each must so conduct him or herself as if everything depended on him or her. Only on this condition may he hope that a higher wisdom will provide the fulfillment of his well-intentioned effort. So hope is for happiness. Hope is also, it looks like, for something like making a difference, or that your efforts, especially if you act as though it's all up to you, even though you know, of course, most of your actions are futile, that somehow then you may hope that somehow things work out such that you contributed to making a difference. So Kant says each must, but he also recognizes, I think, the sense of futility that I think a lot of us, certainly in large capitalist global markets, feel when we think about making change on some sort of important scale. So I think he's sensitive to this thought. He says a little later in the religion, we have a natural need which, if not met, would be a hindrance to moral resolve, Entschließung, to conceive some sort of final end of all our doings and non-doings taken as a whole, one that reason finds justifiable. So there's a sense in which we might find our resolve weakened or even undermined if we can't think of some, in terms of the ends, the consequences, the results of what we're doing, and not just that we're willing in accordance with the moral law. In the religion, Kant says that the first degree of the propensity to evil is fragilitas, frailty, expressed in the complaint of St. Paul, what I would, that I do not. So you still adopt the law, the good, into the maxim of your will. It's interesting because it's the first degree of the propensity to evil, and it still involves adopting the law into your will. So you are motivated by the moral law. But this good, which objectively in its ideal conception is irresistible incentive, is subjectively, when the maxim is followed, the weaker in comparison with your inclination. So you are frail. Something about your resolve is lacking, even though there's a sense in which you're fully aware that there's a rational incentive that is sufficient for action. So I think there are two ways in which we can think about what's going on here, and I'll call it demoralization in a kind of double sense. I like that term, which I get from Robert Adams, who's used it in a somewhat different context, because it connotes both sides of what I think is going on here. So there's demoralization, which is just this general despair in the face of futility, or the unlikelihood that full justice will arrive, or that you will make a difference in that regard. Then there's also a demoralization, that is a loss of resolve to do what you continue to think you morally ought to do. So as the apostle says, I do not do what I ought to do. We know that Kant was not a traditional divine command theorist or a consequentialist. Morality, quote, needs neither the idea of another being above him in order to recognize his duty, nor as an incentive anything other than the law itself in order to observe it, but famously also not a Stoic. So in the moral proof, he's clearly focused on the rationality of our hope for appropriate happiness, where happiness is a kind of sensible bodily condition. And in this third version of the proof, he explicitly characterizes that hope as stabilizing our moral Entschließung, our resolve. So it's not consequentialism. It's not that you do something because it promotes the most for the best, or for the best for the most. But it is a kind of, after you've willed the moral law, there's still a kind of dependency on an awareness or a hope for or a belief in consequences that result from your moral acting. And there's this passage that I really like in the third critique about Spinoza, which is worth reading just because it's a fun passage. Kant says there's a righteous man, Spinoza, who takes himself to be firmly persuaded that there's no God and also no future life. I mean, it's weird because Spinoza, of course, thought everything was God, but in the 18th century German context, thinking that was tantamount to thinking that God doesn't exist because God can't be everything. So unless you're a novalis who thinks of Spinoza as that God-intoxicated man, you're going to think of him as an atheist, as you all know. So Spinoza is somehow a righteous atheist. He doesn't demand any advantage for himself from his conformity to the moral law, whether in this world or another. Rather, he would simply and unselfishly bring about the good to which that holy law directs all his powers. But his strivings have limits. Psychological limits, I'm going to suggest. Deceit, violence, and envy always surround him, even though he is himself honest, peaceable, and benevolent. The other righteous people that he encounters at times will, in spite of all their worthiness to be happy, nevertheless be subject by nature, which pays no respect to that, to all the evils of poverty, illness, and untimely death, just like all the other animals on earth. It will always remain so until one wide grave engulfs them altogether, whether honest or dishonest. Here it makes no difference and hurls them in den Schlund des zwecklosen Chaos der Materie zurückwirft, auf dem sie gezogen war. There's kind of a brutal passage about the futility of our moral acting. Kant's result, either Spinoza will have to give up his end of being righteous as, and here I want to say psychologically impossible, in the face of all this deceit, envy, and despair and so forth. Or he'll have to accept the existence of a moral author of the world, that is of God, but from a practical point of view. So this is the psychological motivation for accepting or forming belief in something. I see this also in the Gemeinspruch essay, in the discussion of explicit discussion of futility. Here is just a piece of it. It does not matter how many doubts may be raised against my hopes for progress, hopes to be contributing to progress, by citing history, doubts which, if they were proved, could move me to desist from a task so apparently futile. As long as these doubts cannot be made quite certain, I cannot exchange the duty for the rule of prudence not to attempt the impracticable. So it looks like Kant is aware of the problem of futility. He's sort of anticipating this discussion about causal inefficacy and the psychological results. And he's also aware that perhaps we need, not as our sort of rational incentive, but in order to keep our Entschließung going after the fact, to form certain kinds of hopes and ultimately certain kinds of beliefs. So here's one way to reconstruct it on page 3, rather exhaustively, but it gets in front of you what I take to be the structure. So it's that weak, independent first premise, just I ought to do what's morally right. Now an empirical premise, so it does have empirical psychological premises in it. For me, it would be demoralizing in the first sense not to be able to hope that there's a moral order by which a just arrangement will come about, for then we would have to regard it as certain that the entire history of the world will not be good on the whole, no matter what we do. So if you can't even hope, then you must be certain that injustice will ultimately be the result. Such demoralization has an enervating effect on my resolve and is thus demoralizing in the second sense. I will no longer perform actions that I take to be morally good or required, like Spinoza, like the Apostle. Two empirical premises, not true for you, then you don't have to worry about this. True, I think, for most of us, true for righteous Spinoza, true for the Apostle Paul, true maybe for Immanuel Kant. Double demoralization of this sort is seriously morally undesirable. That seems just clear, given that we ought to do the morally right thing. Therefore, there's serious moral advantage for me in being able to hope that there is a moral world order. Just to be able to hope that there's a moral world order. Now things get a little more dicey. Let's say that average hope or kind of banal hopes don't necessarily require anything more than the presumption that the thing you're hoping for is really possible, or at least you're not certain that it's really possible. That's how I tend to think of kind of everyday hopes. But arguably a deep and life-structuring hope like this might require more than that. It might require kind of a firm commitment of some sort to the idea that this thing that you're hoping and willing towards, trying to contribute to, is practically possible, really practically possible. Where that's a sort of technical term to mean something like able to be sort of the things and beings and states of affairs in the world are such that they have the power ultimately to bring it about, that P. So this would require an independent argument, but I think that something like this realizability constraint on hope is part of what Kant's thinking, and I think it has some plausibility. Therefore, there's serious moral advantage for me in having firm positive assent that a moral world order is really practically possible. So not just to hope for it, but also to have some sort of commitment, at least to its real possibility, that it could come about. But if a being or state of affairs is practically possible, then there must be some set of things in the actual world that account for that fact. That just follows from the conception of practical possibility. And then the big premise for Kant, the actual existence of God and the immortality of the soul provides the only adequate account of the real practical possibility of a moral world order. There would be a lot of argument would be needed, of course, to establish that. And he thinks he can do it by looking very closely at what exactly a moral world order would require. But let's just set that one aside. I really just want to get the structure of the argument in front of us. So therefore, there's a serious moral advantage for me in being able to have firm positive assent that God exists, the future life exists. Now we've got the transcendental dialectic, of course. There are no good epistemic reasons either for or against the existence of God. We can't prove God's existence. All efforts to do so have failed, but we also can't prove that God doesn't exist. We are denying knowledge of that in order to make room for this kind of faith. So rational belief requires good epistemic reasons. Rational conviction, Überzeugung, requires good epistemic reasons. Therefore, conviction in God's existence is irrational, but rational belief with the capital B, Glaube, does not require good epistemic reasons. It can instead be based on good moral or pragmatic reasons. So that's the qualified evidentialism. Evidentialism about Überzeugung, pragmatism about Glaube. Überzeugung and Glaube are the two kinds of firm positive assent. Therefore, other things being equal, belief, though not belief, that God exists is morally, though not epistemically justified for me. So it's subject, it's I believe, as Kant says in the canon. We can't even say that God exists. We can just say, I must believe that God exists. And it's based, in this case, on some, I think, plausible but empirical psychological premises. Isn't this still a kind of self-deception or a pernicious form of Feuerbachian wish fulfillment? Maybe, but I think there are some ways to try to resist this conclusion or resist the idea that it's entirely pernicious. So it's not required. Remember, if Spinoza was a little bit more steadfast in his resolve, he could just keep willing and not be faced with the kind of futility worries that seem to afflict him, at least in the third critique passage. So there might be some moral saints for whom such hope and such belief isn't required, and I think to them, Kant would say, I suspect he thinks it's implausible that there are any such, given how he thinks of us as kind of this union of sensible and rational faculties, but perhaps there are, and Kant would just sort of wish them well on their way. Even with respect to those for whom belief in a supreme superintendent of all of this is morally crucial, Kant is not recommending self-deception. For recall, the issue is essentially epistemically ambiguous and undecidable. There is, and I think in the Transcendental Dialectic, we're told that there can be no persuasive theoretical evidence for or against the existence of such a being or against the future life. The belief the argument underwrites is morally, not epistemically justified. So there's no claim here that there's epistemic justification for this. It's defeasible moral justification. Defeasible because if we find out later that there are moral disadvantages to this sort of belief, if holding capital B belief in God and the afterlife starts to look like it doesn't have these serious moral advantages that we were suggesting it would, or if it starts to make people act in ways that look like they're violating the moral law in other ways, that would be sort of defeating the argument such that you wouldn't have this justification anymore. So it's not mere wish fulfillment in that way. Finally, the goal is not to feel better or satisfy our wishes, but to receive essential sustenance in the moral life. I mean, what more would you need in order to say something counts as morally justified, even if not morally known? So the result is not moral knowledge, but moral faith, or moral capital B belief, but it's justified in this sort of interesting psychological way. So I think this is an interesting argument. I think it hasn't really been noticed that there's this kind of third way of thinking about the moral argument. People really focus on the second way. And I also think it's interesting now kind of returning to our own concerns about effective altruism and whether or not we can make a difference. So there is this little literature now on what it is to make a difference and why that's important. You might think that maybe there's a way to get via Kant's argument or something like Kant's argument from some such psychological premises to a result with respect to our own difference making. So here would be the analog. I ought to, let's say, abstain, we're just going to talk now about consumer ethics, abstain from purchasing the products of a morally objectionable part of whatever it is that you're worried about, the industrial food system, the sweatshop labor system, the coffee system, and so forth. So you think you ought to abstain from purchasing those things? Despair would result from at least not being able to hope that your abstinence will make a significant positive difference with respect to that thing that you think is morally objectionable. Such despair is seriously morally undesirable. Therefore, there is serious moral advantage in being able to hope that my abstinence will make a significant positive difference with respect to that thing. So it's desirable for me to be able to just have hope that some difference will be made, some connection to my actions will ultimately bring about a better situation with respect to the plight of these beings that I'm concerned about. Therefore, other things equal, hope that my abstinence will make a significant positive difference with respect to this thing is morally justified. Okay, so it's relatively close to the original argument. Here we have the premise for which we would need a little bit more argument, but which I'm not trying to give argument here. Deep and life-structuring hope requires a firm, positive affirmation, assent that P is really practically possible. So, belief or faith that it's really practically possible that my abstinence will make a significant positive difference is morally justified. And now you can see where it's going and where it kind of falls off a cliff. So here's what I was calling one of the key premises that we just have to grant Kant in the other argument. But there it at least looks a little bit better to say that the existence of God or some such thing is the only adequate account of the real practical possibility of the highest good. I mean, again, after all, the highest good is supposed to be this sort of cosmic system that is set up such that the most intimate details of your motivation are somehow, and your deeds are reflected in the happiness that you ultimately experience. And this is why Kant thinks we need to advert to a being that can see in great detail all of your motivations and deeds, and also has the power and ability and desire to set things up such that perfect justice is ultimately done. It doesn't look like there's any such argument here for the analogous premise that the existence of God or even a karmic system or whatever would provide the only adequate account of the real possibility that your abstinence will make a significant positive difference. It may provide an adequate account, but not the only account. And so I think we can't go from there to some sort of big supersensible conclusion. Part of that is because there are other morally justified options that we can sort of focus on in our hoping to help us sustain resolve. So there are these like supersensible mechanisms, providence, Kantian providence, karma, other variations of these kind of supersensible mechanisms. But insofar as we're not forced by something like this argument into committing to those kinds of supersensible mechanisms, it seems like a big bullet to bite to go ahead and say, well, you know, at some point I'm going to be a vegan for my whole life, and at some point along the way when I decide to abstain, or when the department at Cologne decides not to order the meat but instead the vegan lunch, which is great, there will be, despite the fact that there are billions and billions of animals involved in this huge, huge system, and there's a lot of waste and buffers all the way, and it's not fully vertically integrated and so forth, there will be at some point, maybe via kind of karmic arrangement or a divine arrangement, providential, some point I will actually causally change that system for the better. And I just sort of fasten onto that hope, and I have to then sort of have faith that this supersensible mechanism exists. That all would work, but it's just not sort of required in the way that it would be for Kant's version of the argument. And so I think that that's a big bullet to bite. If you have that in your ontology already, then maybe it makes sense to go in this direction. I also think there's a tendency to quietism in the kind of supersensible approach here. So you might think, if you really think that karma is going to sort of sort it all out in the end, or God's going to get done what needs to get done in the end, you might yourself start to think, well, you know, my role here is just to not so much engage, but to, I don't know, worship or something like that. So Franz Rosenzweig is a great Jewish theologian, philosopher of the 20th century who says that religious people ought to be involved in liturgy and piety, and politics is not for them. God will work things out. Or in the words of a mega church pastor in the US named Mark Driscoll, article I found where he is quoted saying something like, why do I drive an SUV despite the fact that I, you know, climate change and so forth? Because I know who made the world, and he's coming back to burn it all up and make it over again, and so I'm not concerned about it. Something really, you know, I mean, relying on a certain eschatology, which is a supersensible mechanism for thinking about how justice will ultimately be done, one that a lot of people, maybe more people in the US than in Germany, accept, but a quietism then about sort of political activity. Saving souls is what's important now, not saving the climate. All right, so that's one option, some moral justification there, but not overwhelmingly attractive for other reasons, perhaps. You could focus your hope. So I tend to think of, in Manchester last week, I was giving another paper about my own account of hope. I think that it tends to involve a certain kind of, or at least significant hope involves a kind of focus or disposition to focus on an outcome as possible. And that requires a certain kind of effort sometimes, especially when the possibility is extremely slim. So you're very likely to be sort of shifted over to focusing on the high improbability of something happening if it's like 99.9% unlikely or even worse. Yet, it is possible, of course, that just through the sort of causal laws that we ordinarily believe in, not through some sort of supersensible mechanism, it's at least barely possible that you will at some point stand on the threshold where, you know, if you order something or buy something, you will move the system forward by some huge bulk order such that another series of injustices occurs or animals are killed or whatever it is you care about. Maybe it's at least possible that you will be pivotal at some point, though the numbers don't look very good, especially when you're talking about things like chickens, where 2,000 of them will have been slaughtered by the time I finish this sentence. They're like 45 billion per year globally, 45 billion. So it's a massive system where your little purchases probably aren't going to make a difference, but they might. So it's physically possible. Hard to hope for this rather than to despair, as I was just suggesting. Moreover, hoping for these very improbable outcomes can be practically irrational. You focus on the fact that if you just keep on not buying that sweatshop sweater, then maybe you'll make a difference. And you might then practically sort of ignore the things that could be really effective. So this is what the effective altruist is going to worry about with respect to these efforts to always be concerned about integrity in your own individual purchasing behaviors. Why not do the things that are more likely to make a difference? It might also be epistemically irrational insofar as it leads you to overestimate the chances of making a difference. If I just keep, I have so many meals left in my life, and I figure, one of those meals I'm going to be pivotally on the threshold and make a difference. That's actually extremely unlikely. Okay, so those are sort of some ways in which you might go. You might have moral justification for going with respect to this analog of Kant's moral argument. Another way to go would be, in some sense, to depart from the consequentialist line of thinking out of which this causal inefficacy discussion tends to arise, and start talking about things like symbolic value, or what I just mentioned, integrity or some authenticity or something like that. So you stand with the good, you try to avoid the moral taint involved in touching or wearing or eating or being involved with products which you think are produced in a morally objectionable system. I had a graduate student when I was at Penn who wrote a blog post actually in 2016 about why she remained a vegan even though she thought it didn't make a difference. And it got picked up by an anthology on food ethics, and is actually published now beyond the blog. But she sort of invokes these kinds of considerations. So I just felt sad every time I looked down at my plate. Where I used to see a pork chop, I now see a tailless, crusty-eyed, psychotic sow. And it's important to me that I keep this aversion going. I have no wish to remain in a system I don't believe in, even if my withdrawal makes no impact. So there's some kind of, she doesn't want to be tainted by or involved with a system that she finds objectionable. A system in which, say, sows are stuck in crates where they can't turn around for much of their life while producing multiple litters. Okay, so you might think that there's sort of some moral justification coming out of the argument for developing this kind of theory of value. I mean, it's sort of weird to think of developing your axiology out of a moral argument, but you might think there's strong enough reason here. You might do that, and people who talk about symbolic value, like Tom Hill or Anthony Appia, Robert Adams, Terence Cuneo, will sometimes cite these inefficacy or futility concerns as motivating their axiology here. So it's a mysterious axiology. It's not very consequentialist friendly, and that might be a sort of negative for a lot of people in this discussion. Maybe not Kantians, however. Finally, you might think now a final option is just crying out to be mentioned. I mean, why is all of this so individual? Why can't we think in terms of groups? Like, let's be activists and do what really changes things and think in terms of the collective and political action. So I think maybe this is where the moral argument that we're looking at probably directs most of us. It's not a guarantee against despair, but given the kind of collective nature of it, you want to be doing something with others such that the group itself makes a difference, whether or not you are a but-for difference maker. So one way of talking about a difference-making relation is a but-for difference relation. So if you hadn't done it, then it wouldn't have occurred. That's like the strongest kind of difference-making, but-for. There are other conceptions of difference-making. But the thought would be, even if you're not a but-for difference maker, you might still be part of the collective that makes a difference. And the collective would have made a difference even if you hadn't been involved. So maybe that's going to be sufficient for people to sustain their moral resolve. Taken alone, this does now look like it hasn't really solved the original problem, which was to sort of combat the opportunistic urge, which is to say, I'll do whatever I want when I'm in private because it almost certainly doesn't make a difference, but I'll of course do what is more likely to make a difference, work with the group and encourage lots of other people and sign petitions and engage my local politicians and so forth. So there might be a concern here that the opportunism comes back, and maybe that's something that we should accept. Or maybe there's something in one of these other options or some other option that can help us combat it. The last thing to remark is that Kant is focused on, as we saw in that passage from Religion way back at the beginning, about efficacy, Kant seems to be focused on the idea that you are, in some sense, a contributing cause. You have to act as though it all depended on you. Sometimes sounds like a but-for difference maker. If but for you, it would not have occurred. You have to believe that or be committed to that, affirm that in some way. So it's not clear to me, but perhaps he would think that that in itself is part of what would follow from the moral argument, that we would have defeasible moral justification for belief in yourself as a sort of but-for difference maker by way of your cooperation with the group. Okay, so conclusion, the need to sustain resolve and avoid despair in the face of perceived inefficacy seems to provide, if you like this form of argument at all, and of course some people just think moral arguments are so strange, but this is an effort to come up with one that looks respectable from a contemporary point of view, but also is grounded, I think, in the Kantian texts. Prima facie, defeasible moral justification for taking one or more of these approaches, or others if there are some, but not for taking any one in particular, so you don't get God or karma out of this in the way that Kant would have liked with his argument. In each case, there are propositions about the actuality or possibility of various things that the subject has to hold for true in order to sustain moral resolve. But all the value here seems to be in the holding for true, in the affirming, rather than in it being true, which is a kind of interesting aspect of moral proofs in general. Oftentimes it's what's justified is you believing that, you holding for true, rather than, or what's important is that you hold it for true rather than it actually be true. Okay, I'll leave it at that.